I'm Slava Silva. Welcome to Conversations with Slava. Today, I'm talking to Samuel Moyn, Henry R. Luce Professor of Jurisprudence and Professor of History at Yale University. We are discussing the book Humane: How the United States Abandoned Peace and Reinvented War. Professor Moyn, what is the thesis of your book?
The thesis of the book is that there's a risk in making war more humane, which is something that elites in various places have tried to achieve in the past several decades. And the risk is one of the entrenchment, the facilitation and legitimation of war. And I don't think it's a big risk, and I don't think it's necessarily incurred. What that means is that it's usually a good idea to make war humane. And I actually think it's never a good idea to leave it brutal or make it more brutal. But if there's a risk in some cases, then it has to be controlled. And I try to show that this didn't happen in the war on terror that the United States initiated 20 years ago. And it's part of the reason why this war has become endless, so-called, a forever war that doesn't cease.
Is there such a thing as a humane war?
Well, it sounds like a contradiction in terms, and yet I think we have to acknowledge the possibility of more humane war. I think everyone understands that wars are more and more frequently claimed by militaries and states to be more humane, but I think they actually are. Now, the point is not to trivialize the residual brutality in war, which is very real and outrageous. But I think it's a mistake to pretend that the brutality in war is either increasing or static. I think it has increased in the 20th century, but I think great power war in the 21st century is distinguished by its comparatively less violent methods. And more important for the argument of my book is that there's an attempt to normatively and legally regulate war, which is having an effect on it, a humanizing effect, which I do think is unprecedented. And so maybe we conclude that we still ought to focus on brutality. But if I'm right, then we also have to do the opposite, to focus on how differently war is being waged or can be waged. Because if there's this risk I'm talking about, then focusing on brutality could exacerbate the risk. It could lead to the perception and reality of cleaner wars, which then last longer.
A central part of your work is the drone campaign. At the beginning, the wedding, and towards the end, the Soleimani assassination. You have commented on this type of warfare. If you include special operations, economic war, cyber war, does it change the balance? Does it change your thesis?
Well, I certainly include the increasing use of special forces, small teams of soldiers who visit and kill. A drone did kill Qasem Soleimani, but special forces killed Osama bin Laden or Omar al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS, as the Islamic State. And data show that there's just an extraordinary increase in the geographical spread and just sheer deployment of special forces. And I think that, you know, the more novel forms of war shouldn't be, you know, treated as just drone warfare, except if we take it to epitomize a new form of war. I am pretty literalistic otherwise with war and don't consider broader, you know, conceptions of force, especially economic force. And I only mention cyber war since it's let's say emergent. I do have a fair bit in the epilogue about autonomous weapon systems, which, unlike drones, which are piloted even from far away, have no human control except algorithmic programming at the beginning. And so it's a study that is not denying the importance of other things, but is focused on what people have called war, the use of military hardware and means to inflict violence and kind of, you know, control and surveil people physically and beyond, and across long distances, and especially beyond state borders.
New York Times, November 13th, 2021. How the US hidden airstrike that killed dozens of civilians in Syria. Dave Phillips, Eric Schmitt. It's about the Bagus strike in 2019. When such stories come to light of dozens civilians killed,
right?
And this information until recently classified, and were people who revealed it possibly facing felony charges, in some cases in jail, like Daniel Hale. Does it change your view as the war being humane? To what extent is the inhumanity just hidden better and concealed?
Right. Well, I have no problem acknowledging the extraordinarily outrageous, you know, acts that came to light the other day. It's very, you know, common and unoriginal to say that war is brutal. The real question is, I think, twofold. First, is it as brutal as before? And I'm trying to make the novel and original claim that it's not. And that it doesn't at all commit me to denying residual inhumanity, let alone trivializing it. But more important, there's a question of whether it's most morally urgent to stigmatize atrocity and war crimes. You could do so for several reasons. One is because they're wrong, and I think that's the best answer. But it is really important, I think, to insist that if that's all of morality, then we incur this risk through our focus of basically asking militaries and states to make their wars more humane without constraining the wars themselves. So you'll note that, you know, in the discourse around this New York Times story, understandably, there's no mention of the fact that the war over Syria is itself illegal. If the alternative being, you know, demanded is a more humane form of it, then we lose this other urgent claim that it would be illegal even if humane, even if all the laws of armed conflict were followed to the letter, even if the United States, you know, because war involves bad apples and honest mistakes, you know, changed its procedures and sought accountability for crime, you know, which it won't do, obviously. I guess my final thought is that I mentioned that, one reason to stigmatize atrocity and war crimes is because they're wrong, but another is instrumental, that you think that doing so will help you gain traction for sapping the legitimacy of the war itself. And especially if you think that saying the war is illegal will not work as well as attacking the crimes of war in the war, then you might have a really good reason to focus on brutality, even if I'm right that it's in decline. And I guess my response there is that, well, it could work either way. I have a whole chapter about Vietnam in which I argue that the revelations of the My Lai massacre, which were like this, presented even to this day as representative of American fighting, which is not true, added a huge amount of fuel to the fire of a pre-existing anti-war movement. But in the war on terror, we haven't had one. And so the stigmatizing atrocity and war crimes has more regularly led to the humanization of endless war. That's what happened when there was a debate around Abu Ghraib after it was revealed the abuses of prisoners there in the spring of 2004. And so this focus, which I think is understandable and necessary and understandable, has risks. And namely, it could help debug a program of continuing war rather than participating in ending it. And I think that's not been said in general and in response to this latest, revelation.
You also point to the different reaction when the Pentagon papers were revealed and when the papers about the Afghanistan war were revealed. How do you explain this contrast? Were people so much less afraid of communism taking over when they have been until recently and now afraid of terrorism taking over?
It's a really interesting contrast, and your hypothesis is worth some exploration. I'll just note that I think that it really mattered that there'd been mobilization around the war before Daniel Ellsberg leaked the Pentagon papers to the New York Times reporters. And what was really significant was elite support for a very long time for the Vietnam War that basically melted down in response to this revelation of how bungling and ineffective America as a superpower was. I think, 50 years later, it's so obvious to anyone who has eyes to see that America is not in charge, doesn't know what it's doing. And I think that's probably the biggest reason why the Afghanistan papers, which revealed that from the beginning there was no clear agenda or objective, and they failed at everything they tried. I think that's the main reason why there was less effect. I also think there have been several elections in which presidents ran against the parts of the war on terror, and that's because it was widely understood far earlier what a fruitless and quixotic enterprise, especially the heavy footprint interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq, had been. I think you raise a really interesting dimension of this, which is that maybe elite blindness about American intervention was stronger because it actually was more believable that communism was a dangerous thing, whereas the terrorist threat, in a sense, crystallized as something that could motivate intervention very quickly after 2001 and very pervasively, but in a sense, it proved very fragile. And the war on terror was I think deemed illegitimate in elite spaces within several years. It didn't take 20 or 30 and like the kind of massive event like the Vietnam War to happen. And I think that suggests a real difference between the staying power and the threat perception around communism and around terrorism.
But why then so little questioning of the war itself after Abu Ghraib?
Well, I think that we're dealing with a very kind of, let's say, contingent situation, in as much as it was in just a few months that the strategy of opposing war crimes rather than the war crystallized, and there were a lot of different kinds of participants in that coalition. I mentioned those who oppose torture, et cetera, on principle, and they're noble people. And then there are those who also were just believed in kind of American power if it could be deployed humanely. And they had an ideological reason to separate the wheat of American war from the chaff of American war crimes. And then there were those who had the opposite view, but bet that they could most effectively delegitimize war by focusing on its crimes. And their bet, basically they lost. In fairness, no one could anticipate that Barack Obama would so brilliantly take advantage of the way that the early form of the war on terror was undermined in order to reinvent the thing, precisely by touting its humanity and reinventing it in new humane form. So I'd say, like, we can't imagine that there could have been not an immediate, but an eventual different response to the war on terror that shut it down. That was especially true after the killing of Osama bin Laden. But I think that it may have, it's very counterfactual. But at any rate, we can imagine an anti-war movement that didn't, let's say, always take the option of stigmatizing war crimes to see if it could gain traction around war. As I mentioned, the elections seem to prove that there's a reservoir of non-interventionism in amongst the American electorate. Now, that doesn't mean it would be easy to capitalize on that kind of from a mobilizational perspective, but I guess I think that it's not obvious that there's only ever the choice of stigmatizing war crimes. And movement building for peace, the Vietnam example shows, is crucial in a sense for having a big effect when you focus on war crimes. And yet again and again in the war on terror, we see little, peace advocacy compared to kind of the horror around the repeated, revelations of American brutality.
Professor Moyn, have you directly or indirectly influenced the drone program under President Obama now with your book?
No, I think this is, an academic argument that got some public attention, but at the very time it appeared, Joe Biden was, in a sense, finishing the job that Bush and Obama initiated of transforming the war on terror away from, heavy footprint intervention in order to perpetuate an endless light and no footprint form of warfare. And Biden openly announced he was doing so in preserving counterterrorism and over the horizon operations. And I haven't seen my argument gain much traction, to be honest. And in fact, there's a lot of skepticism about it. So that could mean it's mistaken. But if it's right, it suggests that it's very hard to find the right time to make it. As you say, in certain circles, it could seem bad form to say that atrocity consciousness, it has a principled basis, but is a bad strategy for peace. And because it sounds like you're saying that atrocities themselves aren't that bad. Of course, that's ridiculous. I'm trying to revive an older American view that if you focus on war, you keep war crimes from happening, but the reverse isn't true. And it was widely believed after World War II that war is the gateway drug to war crimes, and if we stop it at the start, we don't get down the road. But it seems as if that insight is very hard to retrieve because I've failed to do so.
Where do you draw the line between activists, lawyers, influencing government policy, or becoming co-opted, becoming tools, cogs in a machine, allowing the government to proceed? And I would like to read from the New York Times article. A legal officer flagged the strike as a possible war crime that required an investigation. But at nearly every step, the military made moves that concealed the catastrophic strike. The death toll was downplayed, reports were delayed, sanitized, and classified. That officer isn't changing anything. In fact, that officer is arguably just part of a system.
So it's a really tough question, and I have disputes with colleagues and friends about it. I think the risk of cooptation and irrelevance turns out to be very high, and the likelihood of making a big difference is much lower than many believe. And it's in part for that reason that I'm kind of holding out for better options, although I'm not claiming that it's obvious what they are, in the absence of an organized peace movement of any great significance. I guess I would say that, we maybe shouldn't focus the discussion on this event, which may have been unusual, especially insofar as the lawyers were marginalized. I tell a story in which lawyers were very central to giving permission slips to the United States to go to war anywhere and everywhere, and in which they created, by choice, a a new form of legitimation for war precisely when they did get to affect it, by making it relatively more humane, under new rules, both international and ones that American lawyers kind of made up, to kind of mimic, international standards. So there's an empirical question: how regularly are lawyers attempting to reach an outcome and get overridden by more powerful forces in the bureaucracy and the military? I don't think that's very common. I think it's much more common to see, lawyers participate in the facilitation and, legitimation of endless humane war, and that's my account.
By asking whether the war itself is just, you are in a way excluding yourself. You are making sure the so-called blob will not accept your argument, and you will not join the administration.
Well, yes and no. I mean, I think that, the propriety of war morally and politically, if not legally, remains central to the mainstream. And you do see occasional, flashes of insight that not every war is worth fighting. Obama in contemplating action in Syria, or at least a lot of rhetoric from Trump and Biden, who had to kind of daringly oppose, the war party that, wanted the Afghan withdrawal not to happen. And I think that's because, though I think they're operating with the wrong morality, a lot of political actors are more sensitive to the fact that their wars aren't working out and are counterproductive in the extreme. And yet I don't think they're very far into that insight, because, I think in the most obvious example, Obama, when accosted by a peace activist in 2013, acknowledged that, endless war, aside from not doing much to beyond actually making the terrorist threat worse, could disfigure American politics at home. He nonetheless was giving a speech about a permanent, targeted killing campaign. And so I focused very heavily on his rhetoric and that speech in particular, because it's like the insight that sometimes happens in the mainstream gets swamped by other forces and by ethical rationalization. And so I think, I set out to be a gadfly on the margin, not attempting to be taken seriously, not just in the halls of power, but in mainstream political discussion. And there's a huge price, and we've already covered it, the price of irrelevance. But on the other hand, there is hope that's a valuable role for some people to play, because it's about reminding people that they've reached these insights partially, and the question is why they've compromised in doing so, and maybe there's some, modest hope of change in if that's true.
Is the media one of the reasons why it viciously attacked Joe Biden when he announced and carried out the withdrawal from Afghanistan?
All empires have had warmongering medias, and that's a central feature of the history of media all the way back. And America's media is not different. Could be worse, but probably about the same. I think in fairness, the short-term response to the Afghan withdrawal in a lot of media circles related most of all to the fact that those who are serious journalists and have contacts in Afghanistan were afraid for their fate, given the rapidity of Kabul's fall and, the kind of chaotic exit that might not allow, those the Taliban might treat mercilessly to get out. Still, you're completely right that there's almost like a kind of default in especially legacy media, the New York Times, the New Yorker, and so forth, that is still, taking the liberal internationalist neoconservative alliance of the later Cold War as defining, the American foreign policy wisdom. And even though it's basically invalidated by history, the Afghan withdrawal provided a kind of brief moment to kind of like have the fumes of those old ideologies kind of intoxicate people, as if you could get back to an era when it was credible to think of America as a, an indispensable nation for justice and peace in the world. Of course, nobody believes that, honestly. As far as I can see, even in mainstream circles right now.
How has war and peace, especially Prince Andrei, shaped your thinking about war and your skepticism than your book? Why particularly this character and this scene with the sky?
Well, I do have a chapter about Tolstoy, but I'm mainly kind of focusing on what he said at the moment of the creation of the humane aspiration and for war. And it seemed like a device to draw some readers into the story, but I wouldn't say the book is Tolstoyan, except opportunistically. I mean, I brought a theory about the war on terror to this book and found that I could, use Tolstoy as a mouthpiece for that theory, and one who, anticipated that theory, which has been repeated by many other people. One of the aspirations of the book actually is to tell a kind of intellectual history of this, about the skepticism of humane war from its inception to the present. And it's because I'm an heir of that tradition that I kind of could go back and revive Tolstoy at the beginning of it, but it's not as if he taught me how to think. And I don't know what Tolstoy experts will say, but they might consider my reading pretty kind of opportunistic. Although it's not like I would agree. I think everything I find in him is actually there. On Prince Andrei, my main interest is kind of looking at War and Peace as a transitional period in Tolstoy's life before his Christian conversion, after which I find kind of the argument I want to find more present amidst his pacifist, kind of commitments in his later life.
Finally, do you see a figure such as General Telford Taylor who would change the discourse and change how mainstream media and mainstream politicians engage with the war on terror?
Not yet. I feel in a way depressed by the fact that I don't imagine any big reversal of the tendencies I'm charting, and so hold out hope, but not of any immediate transformation. And so it's as with many other things, I believe it's an extreme minority position that, you know, will require you know, many years to become more mainstream, if it happens ever. I do think that as American decline continues, the kind of, you know, geopolitical predicates for the warmongering I'm complaining about evaporate. Of course, declining empires can become more warlike rather than less. And that's the scary thing, I think, about the medium term, although the long term, you know, could see more constructive outcomes if we're lucky, even as, you know, other hegemons will no doubt replace the current one.
What is next for you, Professor Moyn?
I'm going to Oxford in the winter to give the Carlyle lectures in the history of political thought, and I've made Cold War liberalism my topic. So I'll give those 6 lectures and try to publish them as a short book, and then move on to some other things that I haven't, you know, figured out yet.
Thank you very much for this interview.
Thank you.